Welcome to the Smiling at the Future podcast. My name is Christy Rose, and this is my pursuit to glean practical wisdom on femininity, homemaking, finances, relationships, and singleness from the God-fearing men and women in my life. Hope you enjoy this journey with me as we learn to smile at the future. Hi, everyone. Today I'm interviewing Deepak Reju, who is the author of the book, She's Got the Wrong Guy, Why Smart Women Settle. The main premise of the book is what actually motivates Christian women to settle for men with glaring sin issues. Because Deepak is a pastor and a biblical counselor, he has seen the heartache that plays out in marriage when women choose to settle. In his book, he outlines 10 different types of men that you should avoid dating or marrying. We only had time to touch on 3 of those types of men, so if you want the full scope of this topic, I would direct you to go buy and read his book. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Pastor Deepak Reju. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast today, Pastor Deepak Reju. I'm excited to jump into the deep end and discuss this book that you've written called She's Got the Wrong Guy, Why Smart Women Settle. So very interesting title. But before we jump into that discussion, would you give an introduction about yourself to the listeners?
Thank you, Christy. I'm glad to be on, and thank you for the invitation. I'm a senior pastor of Ogletown Baptist Church in Newark, Delaware, which is northern Delaware. It's about 45 minutes west of Philadelphia. We're right in between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. And then this would be about the 18th year of pastoral ministry. So I've pastored in D.C. for the last 17 years, and we transitioned here 13 months ago. I'm married to Sarah. We've been married for 24 years. We have 5 children, 2 college students, and then 3 kids still at home. And we have a 5-year-old golden doodle who is the prized delight of my children. And we're enjoying the gifts that God has given us in terms of pastoral ministry and life as a family here right now.
That's wonderful. Well, clearly from your book, you can tell that you have a lot of experience pastoring and counseling people. And your book was actually recommended to me by another friend of mine, another lady who I've had on the podcast. I hadn't heard about it before, but within the first chapter, I was hooked and I just felt like you would speak so well, so appropriately to the listeners of this podcast, because so many of us are in the, as you describe in your book, the murky waters of dating and relationships. And some of us are keeping our head above water. Some of us are sailing through, but it's good to be reminded of just the warnings, the pitfalls that can happen in this area, because it's a big decision in our lives and it has far-reaching consequences. So we're not trying to fearmonger with this episode or anything of that nature. We're just trying to provide helpful warnings as we see the scriptures do, the Proverbs and other places, examples of what not to do. So we want to heed those warnings, know what to look for, walk wisely in this area. So I'm just curious, what inspired you to write a book about women settling for men who have character flaws?
Well, a lot of the things that I write about come right out of pastoral ministry. So things that I run into the trenches, and then I begin to look around and see, is there anything I can give? And a blog post, a book, an article that would hit on the things I really would need that church member to know. So this came out of a situation where a solid young lady in our congregation, somebody who's faithfully attending, a member who reads the scriptures faithfully, and she just started dating a non-Christian guy, and it threw me off. I thought, wait, what? First of all, what happened? I need to understand what's going on here. And secondly, like, how do we make sure to give her what she needs to understand the dangers of doing this? And I looked around and I couldn't find precisely what I was looking for. There was surprisingly less on the topic of the dangers of dating a non-Christian guy than I thought there would be. I found a scattered blog post or two, and that was just really it. So I went to a publisher that I had conversations with and had done books with before. I just said, "What do you think about this idea?" And by the time the conversation was done, we had the list of 10 guys that I ended up writing about. We brainstormed and list what are the possible guys that we would need to have women think through. And there's an infinite list. So I haven't gone through all the Amazon critiques on this. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a few criticisms of, well, you didn't get this guy and this guy and this guy. Yeah, there are more guys than I could ever name in the book that would fit the categories of you should not settle for them. But I did want to send a warning shot across the bow and say, based on my experience of helping young women and young men, you should not end up with a guy like this and fill in the blank, the commitment phobic guy, the angry guy, the passive guy, the non-Christian guy. You just go on down the list of guys that I named in the book. And I have the advantage of I not only do a lot of premarital, spend a lot of time with singles, but I also do marital counseling. And the marital counseling motivated me to get out ahead of it. And it's changed a lot of what I do with singles and in premarital. I've seen the marriage to the guy who is basically a tyrant, a dictator in the marriage, or I've seen the guy who is completely passive and shows no leadership within the marriage. I've seen what women have had to deal with in their marriage. And so therefore makes me rewind and offer warnings in advance so that young ladies don't end up in that position.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great strategy to start addressing the issues early on. My own grandfather started a youth ministry, and the impetus for him doing that was he was in the Navy and he realized we need to capture the youth for Christ early before they become adults and these patterns and things are in their life. And so I think that's wise to address it early on. And it's interesting with the different men that you address in your book, there were the ones that were like, "Oh, of course, I would not date an unbeliever," or "Of course, I wouldn't date an angry man." But then some of the other ones were a little surprising to me, the passive man, for instance. And we'll get into kind of the nuance of this about, what is what is worth breaking off a relationship over. We're not without sin. We all have sin. So when does it become at that level when it would be unwise to yoke yourself with someone, sinning in a specific way? Yeah, I guess that would be the next question is women are sometimes accused of being too picky. So how do we know when it's appropriate to break off a relationship over one of these flaws?
Yeah, it is really hard to know on your own how you how to choose a guy and stick with him, or when are potential flaws that you're seeing things that are worth breaking the whole relationship. So essential thing I would say is you got to do it in community. You can't make this decision on your own. And a lot of singles, when you date, you just basically it's your own adventure. It's you figuring it out on your own, you doing all the work, and maybe your single friends are invested in a way that they're helping advise you, encourage you, exhort you, whatever else. But you think about it, most of them have the same amount of experience and knowledge as you do. So, what you really need to sort through what is often sometimes the gray categories is this guy unwise or what he doing okay? There's categories of like, it's not the best in terms of leadership, but he's not doing something foolish. You just got to have to sort through a lot of things that aren't always clear. And so you need older, more godly, mature people to look at it and say, that's okay, but that's foolish. Or actually, that's a good sign, and you may not be noticing it. And have people looking over your shoulder, engaged with you, working through things. So there was a young lady who I'd helped in counseling, and she'd come through a fairly difficult past. We'd worked through a number of issues from her past over a course of months. As the Lord would have it, mutual friends introduced her to a guy who was doing college ministry up north, and he was a staff member at a college up north, and they started talking, and Things worked out. So he wanted to come and do his first visit. I was I was a bit surprised because on his very first visit, she scheduled a meeting with me. At that point, I'm a counseling pastor, and then also the senior pastor with the guy on his first weekend visiting. On the one side, it's like, wow, that's shocking for him. It's like, okay, come meet me, but also you need to meet my pastors. But on the other hand, I loved it because she was getting us involved early and getting us engaged in community. Now that might feel like a little too much for a lot of people, like, oh, that's a little extreme. But I like the idea of get the community involved. Have others engaged in what's going on so you don't have to sort through this on your own.
Yes. And I think especially if a woman doesn't have maybe a believing father in the picture or other men and relatives who can step in, especially the church is going to be, those are going to be the protectors in her life in this area. I like how you, in your book, you talk about it's, you made the distinction between the imperfect guy or the problematic man. And in your book, multiple times, you're speaking to how does this man respond to his sin is a key factor in knowing if his sin is going to be a big problem in your relationship, or is he humble and teachable? So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything you want to speak to on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there just to add to what we were just saying, I think the older crowd or the families in a Titus 2 framework gives us a depth perception that years and experience that we don't honestly have when we're single, that we just need in the conversation in dating with one another. And then that helps you sort through like, okay, well, if this guy's sin is just immaturity and he's going to grow out of it, that's super useful to know. And that depth perception helps you see that versus this sin needs to be a deal breaker. And because you're emotionally attached, or there are other good qualities that you see in him and you're mixed about it. You see the good qualities and you hope to downplay the bad qualities because you want this to go somewhere. And they can highlight for you, well, actually, which bad qualities or which qualities that you're uncertain about need to end up being, can we use the term deal breakers? Or they need to be, we need to be something that we pay more attention to because if they don't change, they're going to be trouble in marriage. And I'll do that with different couples. I'll say let's create some markers. And if you see this change, then that's actually a good sign that you guys can move forward. If you don't see this change, you know what? I'm not so sure you should keep going forward in the relationship.
Key word there is change. Do you see growth? And I know I've been in positions before where, I'm seeing some good things. And so I'm holding on to that. Love hopes all things. You're praying for them, you're hoping they'll mature. But the yellow, red flags just keep popping up over and over and over. And soon they outweigh the little good that you see. And I think some women, that good will be, well, he's a believer. That's their baseline. He's a Christian. And yet there'll be a lot of other red flags that are coming up that they need to be paying attention to. What do you think are the reasons that women would settle for a man who has these character flaws? What leads them to make a poor choice?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things. For example, like your basic idolatry of marriage, the institution, and everything that comes with it. I get to not only have intimacy with a man, I get to have children, I get to have a family and a future together. I get to build all of these things is, one thing that young women are taught to cherish for a long time, both in a good way, a good solid Bible believing church is going to hold out the value of marriage, and also in a Disney kind of way, from the very beginning, telling the fairy tales where, Prince Charming comes and rescues the young maiden. Every one of those Disney movies prepares you for one day having your own Prince Charming. But both of those sides begin to make you make marriage a wonderful thing, but every good thing can slip into the idolatry. And with each passing year, the older you get, the bigger the idol becomes. So you turn 39, all your friends have been married for over a decade. They're all starting to have children, and you're at Costco on Friday night by yourself again, or you're going to a wedding by yourself all over again, or you're going to the 19th baby shower again, and you just feel the loneliness that comes. So that, you can feel as I express that, that idol has just grown even more, which means you see the pickiness, especially in the younger years. And as the idol grows disproportionate to what it should be in your life, then the standards begin to get lower and lower and lower as you're willing to settle for things like, well, he showers, he has a stable job, and he's a Christian. It meets the basic requirements. So why can't I get married to him? He gives me he's paying attention to me in a way that none of the other guys at church are paying attention to me. This guy wants to spend his life with me. So why wouldn't I do that so I can have family and a children? I don't want to spend Friday nights by myself anymore. You just see the battle, the tug of war that's going on there.
Yeah, I think that is one of the powerful emotions is you find a guy who actually likes you, pays attention to you, and that for a lot of women is so rare that and it feels so good to be wanted, desired. Obviously, the Lord created us to want that, but from the wrong person, it's only going to lead down the line to more heartache. There's a at the beginning of your book, you also talk about more of the fears that lead women to make a poor choice. And one of the ones I highlighted here is she's concerned that others will look down on her for not having a relationship. And I know that's a struggle to feel like like you said, everyone else has moved on. And this podcast, we've spoken to that issue multiple times of feeling left behind in life, feeling like the train took off, you're still standing at the station waiting for your life to start. And the pressure from family is real where they want you to be married and which is a good thing for them to want, but again that pressure can lead to an unhealthy choice if you're making a decision out of fear. That's going to be a wrong motivation for that.
Could I make a comment on what you just said? So the other thing that's dangerous now is like with the internet, it's not just your local church. You can reach out to anywhere in the world. And the hard part about that is a digital profile may not reflect reality. So there's all kinds of things that you can settle for once you get attached to a guy and discovered him in his full context. So the guy turns out to be divorced, but he didn't tell that to you early on. But you got to know him and found lots of things you like about him. So like I like what you said, like the yellow flags and the red flags, they emerge later. And the more emotionally attached you get, the more those flags can slowly disappear. Therefore, that's why doing it in community, they help you to highlight the yellow and the red flags and not lose your view of what they are and recognize the importance of them in making the big decision.
Yeah, you had that just brief section that you did on online dating, and I do want to do a whole episode on that topic because I would say majority of single women who desire marriage have tried or are trying online dating, and so knowing how to put up the safeguards to protect yourself, understanding that you're not getting the whole picture. And then you brought out something insightful on that point. You were saying how for men sometimes the digital communication can play to their advantage, that they can get a woman emotionally involved without a lot of commitment or accountability because it's all done privately through online communication. So we just have to be aware of that and again finding ways to bring in the community into those. Whenever I've done that, whenever I've tried online dating, I bring my family in. I'm sending them the messages. I'm asking them to help me think about what they're sharing, so I keep it very open in that regard because I know I don't trust myself and I know I don't know everything and I need that input into that important area of my life. One of the men that you describe in your book is you call him the commitment phobic man. So for a woman who doesn't think that that would be a problem in a future marriage, how would you convince her otherwise? And what would a commitment phobic man, what would those tendencies look like in a dating relationship?
Okay, I'll put myself out there and just go ahead and say a year or two of dating gives you everything you need to know to make the decision. So by the time you get to basically a year mark, if you've actually invested in the relationship, you should be able to go ahead and say, like, hey, are we going the distance or not? Now, I'm not saying the lady needs to show up and force his hand on this, though there are times where he could be dragging it out, and that requires certain kinds of conversations. But the things that I've run into pastorally, which would be people have been dating for 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first time I encountered this, they had been dating for 8 years, and there was no clear end in sight. At that point, I thought, you just gave 8 years of your life away to this one guy, and there's no clear commitment. Why are you hanging on? And I know why you're hanging on, everything we've already named. The emotional investment, the personal investment has been so high that you feel like to cut your losses is so severe because of everything that you put into it. So you're still hoping it'll amount to that ring on the finger and that future together. And yet everything has pointed to it's clearly not going to get there. So I'm on the other end of ladies who spent far too much time with guys. It didn't amount to what it needed to. And then helping them sort through the regrets, not doing the hard conversations that are necessary when you have enough information to make a decision. And one of the lies that undermine this is if you just have more time, you can get to know each other better. And so therefore more time will hopefully lead us to a decision. Actually, there's a certain point where you cross where you think, no, actually we have everything we need to make the 20 to 30 year to 40 year to maybe 50-year decision to get married and spend our life together.
One thing that I'm going to just read a quote here from your book because I thought it was excellent. It's always wiser to let commitment precede emotional intimacy and not the other way around. True love understands that faithfulness, commitment, and fidelity are essential ingredients to a long term, stable marriage. So you want to know he's committed to you and that he's moving in a clear direction to commit to a life with you, a marriage with you. If someone, let's say they do end up getting married, they finally pass that milestone, would that problem area show up in a marriage or how would that look in a marriage?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, if he wasn't clear in the dating relationship and he wasn't clear in the transition into marriage, it's not like it's magically going to disappear once you get married. So you're looking for all the indicators in your dating relationship because it's practice for what it's going to look like in marriage. It's pointing forward to what you're going to end up with. And I've seen it on both ends because I've done, years of premarital and then come back and then counsel the same couple. And I can see the lines that you can draw from one to the other. The issues, if a guy is not taking the time to be clear, both in dating and then in getting engaged, and the girl has to be the catalyst to get everything moving, you just wouldn't be surprised that in marriage, you're just going to find the same thing. Like it doesn't magically disappear when a ring gets on the finger. The patterns you see in a man are going to replicate themselves because it's the same guy you married. So therefore, like, I want to give guys plenty of room to grow up. That's why I try to show a lot of sympathy for the young guys who are humble and teachable, just immature. Very different from a guy who is prideful or stubborn or unteachable and not in a good church and just all the other things that we pile on top of it that are problematic. So if a young guy is humble and teachable and a young lady initiates with him and says, hey, you haven't been clear what's going on in the dating relationship, and he talks to an older mentor and realizes that's his fault and he comes back and he shows clarity, well, that's a great sign because that shows he's being responsive, he's learning from an older man, and he's growing in his maturity. In contrast to if she says, I don't know what's going on, and he's not clear and it keeps dragging on, well, that should be a yellow flag that turned into a red flag. And don't be surprised then, marriage is going to be the same thing. You're going to have where you're going to say, I don't know what's going on, and he's just not going to be clear. And your red flag you're now stuck with because you're married.
And one of the main characteristics of masculinity is leadership and initiation and being decisive, making decisions. So I think that's just something to be very aware of what that is going to look like day to day in a life with someone like that. Now, a very, I guess, similar flaw, I don't know if we should call it that sin issue, is the passive man. And I feel like I tend to see this fairly commonly in the church. And I maybe how I'm seeing it is a lot of women are not being asked out on dates. And I think that's why there's many that are going to the internet because at least the men there are initiating and contacting you and talking with you. So, what concerns would you have for a woman who is dating a passive type of man?
Yeah, the main concern would be similar to what we mentioned earlier. I do think men are called to lead in both the home and in the church. I think it's explicit in scripture that men have a responsibility to do that. The leadership that I would describe, though, is a servant-hearted leadership. So it's not a dictatorship from above. Like I heard a guy terribly describe one time, I'm the CEO, she's the employee. And it's a that's a terrible way to describe what male leadership should be within a marriage. Rather, it's Philippians 2, there's a servant-heartedness to their leadership. It's Ephesians 5:25. What did Christ do? He gave up his life for the church. That's what love looked like. We still lead. So, Christ was the head of the church. There is a headship that's involved that scripture describes also in Ephesians 5, but it's a leadership that also leads from below, not just from above. That creates a kind of unity where my best descriptor it would be Genesis 1:24, one flesh, is unity or oneness. Men and women should be a team together, and they should, in most of life, work through it together. In fact, 98% of marriage for me has not been me making a decision on behalf of the family. It's my wife and I making it together, us figuring out together. There's a small percentage of time that I have to decide for the sake of the family and just lead my wife forward. And that requires a guy to take initiative, to be deliberate, to have conversations, to be willing to talk about hard things, to be willing to push where it's uncomfortable, to be willing to see all that as an act of love and a part of their leadership. So passivity doesn't lead to any of that. So just to be clear, like initiative doesn't mean I make all the decisions. That's why I brought up the stuff about being teammates. Like we work at this together, but I still have a responsibility to lead. So if something's not happening, I need to be willing to step up and say, what are we doing? Rather than ignoring it, avoiding it, or just downplaying it. And hopefully we've established enough of a good precedent with one another that she would be receptive to that leadership as we work through things together. And, a good leader is willing to be influenced by his wife. He will show the humility of being willing to have dialogues with her and hear her out and see the wisdom she offers for the two of them to be able to work through together. John Gottman is one of the famous marriage researchers. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's written a lot of material. He's a researcher at the University of Washington, and he does this extraordinary like writes 400-page tomes for PhD students, which I read in my PhD studies, but then he translates them to 100-page New York Times bestsellers. It's an unusual combination for a professor to be able to do something like that. He has these horsemen of the apocalypse, predictors of divorce. And one of his predictors are men unwilling to be influenced by their wives. So you got both sides of this. We started with the conversation about the passivity and a man who doesn't take the initiative. The opposite side is also a problem. A husband who's so arrogant and prideful, he is not willing to listen. Both of those are an issue.
But I like how you said it's a leadership, it's an act of love. You're not dictating, you're not self-serving, but you see your family heading in a more dangerous direction, or you step in and you lead them rightly, right, to and help them to think critically and logically and not be influenced by culture or society or wherever the wrong thinking is coming into that family. And also helpful to talk about the other extreme of kind of the arrogant, prideful man. And that segues us nicely into the next person, the next problem man that I wanted to touch on here. And that would be what you describe in your book as the unteachable man. And they do possess some attractive qualities to women. A lot of times they're very confident and strong, and a lot of women are attracted to that. But what would a life look like being yoked with a man who has that tendency?
This is where the stuff that I just mentioned in terms of being able to work as a team, if you don't have a voice in the marriage, you don't have a say in what goes on, it's not a marriage. So submitting, following someone's leadership does not mean you don't get to use your gifts, you don't get to speak up, your opinion is not heard. Like all of those is a denigration of who you are as an image bearer. So a husband who is unwilling to be influenced by his wife, who won't listen, who's so confident there's no humility involved, that's a dangerous, dangerous future to be tied to. And marriage does not work without humility and repentance. So if he's never willing to say sorry, acknowledge what he did wrong, if there's a consistent pattern of him continually pointing to you and all the things he sees wrong within you, why would you make that permanent? That's what marriage is doing. And you could, argue all the reasons like, well, he's confident, he provides well, he's got a stable job, he goes to church, he professes to be a believer, and yet you're getting trapped in a position where you have no voice or say really in what's going on. And yet you get a husband and children, all the other things that come with marriage. Yet are the fruits of marriage worth really what is you living under tyranny?
Yeah, and I think again it comes down to how does he handle his sin? We're not looking for a man who doesn't struggle with pride to some degree because we all struggle with pride, but is he humble before the Lord? Is he teachable? Is he willing to change? That makes the difference in whether you marry someone or not, or you allow them to grow. Maybe they're not at a position where they should be dating or thinking about leading a family until they see real progress in some of those areas. And maybe for a woman, she needs to make that decision. Do I cut this off? And maybe the Lord will bring us back together, but now's not the right time for us to be a couple. So, how would you encourage the women who feel like all the good guys are taken? They're looking around the church and they're not seeing just the character that they are praying for, hoping for, and they're disheartened by the current dating landscape.
Yeah, the hard part about this is in some of the situations, it is true that you can be in a church situation and there aren't many options. I grew up in a small church of about 80 people, and the guy who led me to faith in Christ is a single guy who he could have chosen to move on because there were no other singles in the church, literally. There was no prospects for him to get married within our congregation. That's a sad reality in a lot of situations. I just want to acknowledge that when some single women look around, there really are no possibilities. And that's what makes them go to online dating and other things like that. But the other that's not true all of the time. So there are things that they need to ask. For example, like, are they overlooking things that would show up in a guy's life as more valuable than they expected? Are they overlooking particular men that they have not paid attention to, but it turns out, for example, the preference and things that they really want out of a guy has mattered more than character qualities that a guy has been currently demonstrating. And so therefore I've had any number of situations where I held out a guy who really godly character and just said, "What do you think?" And I was surprised at the reasons that a guy got written off. I would say they're more in the category of preference than character. And this rule of thumb may not be a favorite of your listeners, but if a guy has good character, you ought to be willing to give him at least one date. If he's got godly character, give him at least a chance to have one time to go out and have a conversation. And you know what? If it doesn't amount to much of anything, that's fine.
Yeah. I think that's really great, and I appreciated that you brought that point out in your book of the areas that maybe women are being too picky over. But I've had the policy of the 3 date policy. If someone has good character, give them 3 dates before you make a decision, and it can grow. I think that's something we've spoken to before on this podcast. You don't have to instantly have the chemistry at the start, understand that that builds and grows, but character is what it can grow from. But we also know that attraction and enjoying someone is important.
Yeah. So we're not saying that you're condemned to be married to a boring guy for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So you're not trapped in a situation that you would never want to be in for the rest of your life. But the other side of it is you do want to give a guy who's got clear godly character a chance. And just see, you might actually be really surprised at what the Lord might do with a relationship that you were not expecting.
And you can just pray the whole time, Lord, change my heart. Help me to love this man if he is the one for me. Now, the end of your book, you have some helpful chapters. You do have a chapter on how to break up for the glory of God, just how to if you realize and it's time to cut this relationship off, then how do you do that well? I really loved the points there. We're not going to get into those in this conversation, but encourage the listeners to go and buy your book and read that part. But I would just love to end here on a more just hopeful note of what does living by faith and trusting God in the waiting look like for a single woman who's desiring marriage?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first part of it is there are some really hard and painful things about long-term singleness. And so therefore, we don't ever downplay them or throw them underneath the rug. We don't brush them underneath the rug. We need to be honest with God about the things that are hard. And so the place for things like lamenting before the Lord some of the difficulties that you've experienced, and He knows your heart. So just be willing to pour it out to Him. That's a part of the conversation is just being honest about some of the hard things that are there. That's the first thing. The other thing is, yeah, you want to be able to put your life in the Lord's hands and really depend on Him rather than making Him your functional God. Like your functional God may be marriage or a man. It really might be that that's really who's going to save you from your turmoil. And so you just got to ask, like, well, who am I really depending on? Psalm 33, our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield, for our heart is glad in Him because we trust in His holy name. So, waiting on God Himself and letting Him be our help and our shield, letting Him give you the strength you need to live faithfully every day. That's really what this amounts to. It's like the Lord may never provide a man, or He may provide a man. We just don't know. But He has provided Himself. And that's where we need to find our hope in. And then you pray for patience. I mean, patience is not an easy thing for any of us. So to ask the Lord to have the patience to endure, not every relationship will end in marriage, but I mentioned much earlier the young single guy, Gary, who led me to faith in Christ. And he chose to stay in a church which had no other singles and poured into the youth. And there's a whole generation of kids who became converted because of his ministry. Well, I was delighted my senior year. A woman showed up at the church. She was a widower. She had a young daughter, and Gary and her started dating and ended up on Valentine's Day, my senior year. I ended up being groomsman in his wedding. So it was just a sweet ending to seeing his faithfulness. It's not to say that everyone who's faithful will end up getting married before they die. Just to be clear, God doesn't promise that for everyone. But, patience does amount to things sometimes that we weren't expecting. And so we just have to keep trusting the Lord that He will take care of us as He's promised in His word.
Amen. One point you highlight multiple times is the fact of the uncertain future as far as marriage goes, and how that is such a walk of faith and such something that we trust the Lord with, because we don't know if God's going to provide marriage or not, but we know that He will be with us and He will continue to sustain us in the life He's called, and He will continue to allow us to be fruitful for Him if we respond well in that waiting season. Thank you for coming on today. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you. And who knows, maybe the Lord will use this in someone's life who's listening, who is maybe ignoring some red and yellow flags, but needs to take those seriously and think about this discussion. Might be a little uncomfortable, but it might save someone from a lifetime of pain in a hard marriage. So appreciate your perspective, and just as a biblical counselor, offering that to us today. And I know it'll leave an impact.
Thank you, Christy, for the time.